Hi, I think everyone's coming up from the basement. Could you please come to the front row is pretty empty, but there's a lot of people, so please don't all congregate in the back. Okay, and we'll wait 2 minutes so that they can get up, finish their cup of coffee, and then we'll start. Did you have the version with the notes? Did you have the version with the notes? This one doesn't have it. No. We'll start briefly, and then I'll call you. I think that's we start. Okay, if everyone could take a seat, we could start. I'd like to get you out by 2:30 and give you time for questions too. So, okay. Um, I'm Bill Etchickson. I'm head of the digital forum here at CEPS. And thank you for coming and being so numerous and being interested in our new study on the German online hate speech law, NetzDG. First, a couple of practical things. We had such a strong sign-up list, registration, that we are web streaming this. And I think the link was sent out just before a half hour ago or so, and tweeted out as well. If anyone wants to listen to it, you would then click on the event page, and there should be the link there as well. Please come up. There's still plenty of seats. Take your time. The second thing is that this is on the record, obviously if it's being web streamed, and you're welcome to quote from the report, from the discussion, how you see fit. Okay, usually events at CEPS can be mostly on the Chatham House rules, but this is on the record. Okay, so the reason we were doing this report, it really came down to, we had kept hearing that the German law was a key test for really how we were going to regulate online speech. It was the toughest law ever put in place in a democracy. And we thought we would take a look at what actually happened, what were the facts around it, and consider the initial results. It's been only 9 months since it went into effect with some headlines. And we found that basically the law was neither created the immediate takedown that we feared, or some of us feared, that Facebook, Google, and YouTube and Twitter were not taking down that much content more than they were doing before. So for free expression advocates, this was not the Armageddon. This was not the hurricane or the earthquake. And at the same time, though, for people who are very interested in fighting terrorism, online terrorism and hate speech, it hadn't proved terribly effective either. It didn't seem to have really changed the way the companies worked in a fundamental way, or the way that they were treating hate speech or preventing a lot of the hate speech from there. So that was our big conclusion, that the law sort of, which was feared from both sides, had failed to either hurt the side of one side or another, or really help that side in these arguments. And we're going to try to explain that now. So the report was done with the Counter Extremism Project, and I and Olivia Nudd here from the project did the research. She did most of it inside Germany, and I did most of it outside Germany. And it was really a great collaborative process in the sense that I think from my background at Google, where I worked on free expression issues, I was tending to be fearful that there would be a sort of take down red button now in my old office. And I think Olivia and the Counter Extremism Project wanted to see whether this really could work, and would like to see more pressure, regulatory pressure on the companies. So with that, we're going to do about 15, 20 minutes, just run through quickly of the report. Olivia, if you could come. And then we're lucky to have three great speakers on this. They'll respond 5, 10 minutes each, or short response. So James Morrison from the Commission, and the author or a key figure in the new EU online terrorism speech proposal, which is going through Parliament. He's going to give us an update also on where that is and where it will go. Then Lucinda Creighton from the Counter Extremism Project, who is a senior advisor there, former Irish minister, and she can explain more broadly what the Counter Extremism Project is trying to do. And then finally, Jens Hendrik Jeppesen. We've been talking about the German NetzDG law together for several lunches, I think, and he's from the Center for Democracy and Technology and has done very interesting reports on the dangers of overfiltering. I think that's fair introduction. Let's go through the report. Olivia, why don't you start, and we'll go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. So just to provide a quick overview of what the Network Enforcement Act, or NetzDG, actually entails. So the scope impacts all social media companies of a commercial nature that have at least 2 million registered users in Germany. So this excludes messaging services like WhatsApp or Telegram. Also, traditional platforms for media journalistic content are also exempt. They have to have very clear, transparent reporting processes for violations against basically the 21 criminal offenses that are included from within the NetzDG law. So they're required to have a reporting form specific to the NetzDG that is accessible to all users on their platform. In terms of handling complaints, all obviously illegal content as it was defined must be removed within 24 hours, but there is some flexibility for content where they're uncertain or where they need to demand more information from a user. They have up to 7 days for that, and that 7-day limit can even be extended if they pass the content on to a self-regulation authority, which they also have the option of doing, setting up within the scope of the NetzDG. In terms of the fines, there's basically a list that was publicized by the government detailing what specifically companies are fined for, but a key point is that companies aren't fined for making mistakes on individual pieces of content. It just relates to basically systemic failure to uphold the stipulations of the law. A further requirement of all tech companies was to have a local representative for basically German law authorities to contact them and to receive complaints. And finally, there was one final amendment that basically just tried to strengthen the user rights with a court order, a victim of hate speech in some cases has the right to find out the identity of the aggressor in cases of civil lawsuits, for example.
So yeah, I think that's a great summary. One thing that we would add and came up is that the word systematic, that the companies had to systematically try to subvert the law or break the law to be prosecuted and to have the very high 50 million euro fine that got a lot of the headlines.
Right.
So it couldn't be just a mistake. It had to be intentional. Okay.
Okay. This is just an overview of some of the stakeholders we reached out. Obviously, we couldn't speak with everyone, but we tried to make an effort to have a well-rounded approach. So we spoke with members of parliament, both in the coalition government and opposition, just to...
In Germany.
In Germany, of course, to gain some insights on the different perspectives. We reached out to officials with the government to see what their take was, the impression of the law 6 months basically after it went into effect. We spoke with different members of civil society, including Jens here on our panel, and of course the different tech companies. We were able to have background informations with them on well to see what their opinion was on the NetzDG law.
And just many of these interviews were conducted on background so they could be franker, and therefore we didn't cite people directly in most of the report.
Right. We found that it was interesting because both people that supported the law and people that were against the law had a lot of criticism about it. People that were in favor of it found that it wasn't strong enough, that it basically lacked the teeth to be effective. Some examples of arguments from organizations that protect minority rights, for example, were that not enough criminal offenses were actually included within those 21, that the law should also apply to all social media platforms, not just the ones that have 2 million users. This was a particularly controversial point on re-uploads that was initially included in the draft bill, but then subsequently taken out. And some civil society organizations were actually in favor of keeping that in, especially for obviously illegal terrorist content, for example. And then the ID requirement that was added in some cases was also quite controversial, given the data privacy regulations. But then...
Yeah, I mean, it was, the critics were that this undermined it. It required a permanent filtering, therefore broke the e-commerce directive, that instead of the government having to really enforce the law on online illegal speech, it was privatized. And that, above all, the companies would try to push a red button. The slightest complaint, they would take down content. So, yeah, and I just wanted to add one thing before we go to the actual results. There was the political context in which this was passed. It was passed very fast, right after the migrant crisis and the subsequent rise, at least as the German government data showed, of illegal content that they figured was illegal content and hate speech on the web. And it was passed very fast before the elections as basically with no impact assessment. It was the Christian Democrat Coalition that pushed it, and the opposition, Greens, voted against it. But it went from proposal to bill 5 months in that very specific content. And it went into law officially in January 1st of this year. And immediately there were these headlines of false positive takedowns, that a satirical quote had been in a magazine had been taken down by, I think, Facebook, and that one of the far-right politicians in the AfD had been, her speech had been taken down as hate speech. So there was a lot of the, I'd say, the free expression side's fears that this was overreach were highlighted in that first month. Okay, now we're 9 months later, and what do we find? We really didn't find any more overblocking or egregious. There's no press articles of examples of politicians being censored or deleted or other types of immediate reach. And the first, at 6 months, the companies were required to produce a transparency report, which showed that they were blocking only about 20% overall of the files, of the complaints filed under NetzDG. So obviously they were rejecting the vast majority. And you can explain this slide.
Yeah, and this is just to show what content was most deleted. It's clear that hate speech and insults were the biggest issues. And the initial graph is just to show a comparison between Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter in terms of how much pieces of content were actually reported or flagged under the NetzDG reporting form.
Okay, and here's the figures I was talking about, which showed from 21 or 27 to 10% of takedowns under NetzDG. I think most of them were done within the 24-hour deadline. The Facebook example stands out because there are very few in comparison items reported under NetzDG, and a little lower on 24 hours, but it was really the number of complaints compared to the others, and that's where we started looking.
Yeah, so that was the most striking aspect for most people, was this huge difference between Facebook and Google and Twitter on the other hand. And we looked into it more, and I mean, it's clear that the way the law was implemented actually differentiated a lot between the tech companies, which sort of explains this big discrepancy between the low numbers for Facebook compared to the others. And this is just a brief overview to show how the NetzDG complaint form was, whether it was integrated or not. For example, Facebook stuck with its separate form, complaint form for violations based on national law, which is how it was before.
So it was like this.
And that's just to show an example of where you flag content violations for community guidelines as opposed to NetzDG reporting form, which it's a bit more complex than simply clicking report post at the piece of content.
Yeah, I mean, it was significant. And I mean, Google and Twitter made it very easy to report this. It was as easy as the sort of community guidelines reporting under NetzDG. Facebook chose to do it and make it really complicated, and got very few postings under this. Oh, okay. Just one other thing. Oh, sorry. No. Back? No. Sorry. I'm not an expert on this. Okay. But one of the things that we did find was that by making it, there's a difference also in Facebook's approach, where they were really going after the community guidelines, trying to push everything through there. The advantage from the get hate speech online was that these takedowns under their community guidelines are global, whereas the ones under NetzDG would only be inside Germany. So, I mean, their overall takedown rate of Facebook was about the same, and they did get, several 100,000 complaints in Germany during the same period, where they would also take down around 20% was it was around there. Just go on now. We've done that. Okay, so there was another interesting thing in the past year with Facebook, that there was very little guidance given by the courts of how they should implement. There was for NetzDG, there was no court decisions on NetzDG, but even about how Facebook should handle its own under community guidelines, its own requests for deletions. And the top two courts were the lower courts, and the OLG is apparently the higher courts, but they're contradictory rulings. Some justices are saying, Facebook can't delete the stuff under its own rules that the users write, and some are saying that Facebook hasn't done enough by keeping content up. So there is a real issue of legal guidance on how to deal with what is illegal and with these takedowns.
Yeah, so there was a fourth organization we also reached out to, and we thought it was important to include them because they're one of the smaller platforms that was affected by NetzDG. They have about 5 million users in Germany, and are not different revenue base, or not based on ad revenues compared to the other two. And it was interesting because they, of course, found that as a small organization, the cost was relatively high at first, but also agreed that this was only an initial cost of setting up the right interface and mechanisms, but that these costs would eventually level out over time. And also interesting was to hear that they had the impression that few users actually knew about the NetzDG or the complaint form. It didn't receive that much publicity. And it seemed to be the case that whenever NetzDG was reported on in the media, that then the number of complaints went up because people became aware that that was an option. And the impression of the platform was that the NetzDG was in fact helping eliminate some of the hate speech and illegal content that was being posted on the platform. And we forgot to mention, it is of course a platform for petitions that anyone can start.
Mhm. The next, we're getting close to the end. So one thing we found was that the government really passed the law and then didn't do much to follow up at all. There was no prosecution, no testing of what systematic noncompliance would be. There is no report from the government. They're not scheduled to make a report or obliged to make a report until 2021. And there was very little guidance or reaction to the initial transparency reports given by the companies. There was only comments that this is just the beginning. So I think our overall feeling was that the government didn't really step up. It passed a law and then took a step back and let it just flop or be as effective as it would be or ineffective without really engaging.
Right, and at the same time, obviously, it's a learning process as well, since it's a new law, and so there's been many conversations in Germany as well about how to improve it, things that should be amended going forward. The Green Party brought forth its own proposal that focuses on other dimensions as well, such as fake news more strongly and issues like social bots, which example aren't included in the NetzDG. And there's also a lot of analysis happening on the state level in Germany as well, among the justice ministers about what we can do or what the federal government can do to sort of establish clearer guidelines, especially in terms of the implementation of the law. So we'll have to see how things develop.
Good. All right, now I think we have our recommendations. First the international implications. I mean, one of the reasons the NetzDG law was controversial was that it was a German law, whereas we really could use a European solution or at least a proposal on this. And since it was put forward, the NetzDG, we have had a European Commission proposal in September to combat online terrorist propaganda. And we also have had the French release a proposal for monitoring online speech during campaigns, electoral campaigns. Both seem to us narrower than NetzDG, which made use the whole spectrum of legal speech. And both, I think, will avoid some of the issues that have been raised by NetzDG by its enormous scope and very few regulations about how it should be carried out or implemented.
Yeah, and finally, just some very broad recommendations, which are not new. I mean, these are also things that have been stated before, for example, that in terms of the implementation, there just needs to be a bit more guidance in terms of how things, compliance laws should be implemented by each tech company to make it a bit more comparable in the end when you have the transparency reports, to be able to do a better analysis of basically the impact. The second point was different content requires different approaches. And as of now, there's 21 different criminal offenses that are included in the law. And some of them merit a faster approach than 24 hours, and others, which are more ambiguous, like hate speech, might merit more time than 24 hours, which has been clear with hate speech. So when it comes to obviously illegal content, there should be some flexibility in terms of the guidelines of how quickly they should be removed. And I think tech companies have also agreed that things like obviously illegal terrorist content or child pornographic content should be removed much faster than 24 hours. One aspect that could be strengthened also is user rights in terms of content that was wrongly removed. Right now, users have the possibility to file a complaint within the Federal Office of Justice if they feel like their complaint wasn't heard. But there's no equivalent in terms of complaints that were removed where the user feels like it was falsely removed. So we would recommend having a clearinghouse for this to dispute content to make it easier for users to do so. And of course, regulation is just one option. It requires many more approaches to combat hate speech, illegal hate speech online. And so one dimension, of course, is to make sure that local law enforcement has the resources and the training they need, especially in terms of cyber competence. There's differences between states in Germany. Some are stronger on this than others. So we would recommend having sort of a more standard approach when it comes to specifically cyber content. And yeah, last point, just in terms of understanding how algorithms work and just the sheer amount of content that is uploaded every day on social media, it's hard to grasp for many regulators, for law enforcement authorities. So we think it's important to continue to be able to do research on the posts that are uploaded daily, and not only to understand the impact that it has during elections, for example, but also to see how much content, specifically illegal content, is circulating, what is being removed. So we would advocate for access to raw data to be able to do sound analysis for the better understanding of not only public authorities, but also just the cyber competence of society in general.
Thanks. Okay, that's, again, I pressed the button too much. No, we didn't go over time. We're good. But if you can get the first. We're now ready to turn to our panelists. I mean, that was a brief. Everyone has a summary of the report, and you now have, I think, all copies. James, what's your reaction? Could you tell us right off a little bit of reaction, but also where the EU law stands and the timetable? I think many in the audience would love to hear that. No, it is not. Wait, maybe.
There. Ah, there you are, Steve. Wonderful. I think this is a very interesting report, and it's an interesting study, and it's part of the process, I think, that we in the Commission went through when we were looking at the spectrum of harms that come from illegal online content. Is it on? It's on. Okay. Okay, I'll speak a little closer. When we were looking at illegal content online, there is a spectrum of harms, and I think we did two things. We started with a voluntary approach on the online terrorist content with the platforms, and we progressively introduced monitoring and performance indicators into that. And at the same time, we looked at the entire spectrum of illegal content, and we decided that there was a certain end of the scale, and at that far end of the scale you have online child sexual exploitation, but then you have terrorist content. And we made a difference between that and online hate speech. And we judged that online terrorist content you can define, and it's illegal offline, so it should be illegal online. And therefore you could bring forward directly applicable legislation for that. On online hate speech, we have a voluntary approach, as you know. We have the code of conduct with monitoring and that sort of arrangement. And that type of content requires human sort of evaluation, whereas for online terrorist content, we say it doesn't. So what we did in our legal proposal that we brought forward in September on that was we basically put a clear definition in, which the member states are discussing at the moment and making even clearer. And we provided for a new legal instrument that said when this stuff is identified, then the competent authorities of a member state issue a thing called a removal order. And when the representative of a hosting service provider is served with a removal order, it's not a judgment question. They have to remove this stuff within 1 hour. Now, that doesn't mean they remove the stuff and delete it forever. They remove the stuff and preserve it because it may be evidence that's required. And equally, because we're not in the game of censorship here, there's an appeal process, and it may well be that at some point that appeal process results in it deserving to be re-uploaded. I doubt it, but there you go. So the removal order is quite simple. It basically creates a sort of floor. If you're served with a removal order, you just do it. It's not a question for discussion. In the instrument, we kept at the same time the process that we have for referrals, where things don't meet that definition, but are judged by the competent authorities in member states to be terrorist-related, harmful, that sort of thing. We have a process for that, so you can also introduce a referral, and then there's a different time period for that. That's not 1 hour, but that's as quickly as possible. At the same time, we introduced something in it to say that when a platform had been targeted, so that means when they'd been served with a removal order or removal orders, then they should take steps to proactively remove the content. And I think you had that threshold. It's when they've been targeted, so there's a clear need for them to act. At the same time, because it was not only the platforms, being the Commission that we were looking at, we also placed some obligations on member states in that to actually set up the equivalent of internet referral units to monitor for this stuff, because not all member states do that at the moment. There tends to be a correlation between member states who've been affected by terrorist attacks or the victims of terrorist attacks and those who have specific capacity in that. And I think another sort of value in it is that because you have identified competent authorities, it makes it much easier from the platform's point of view to know who they're dealing with. Certainly in the process that when we were formulating these proposals, one of the things that I heard a lot from the platforms was that, who do you contact? Who do we have to take it seriously or not? There are standard formulations for the removal orders. There's a standard formulation for the referral, so it brings some order into that. All of the removal orders get copied to Europol, so there is some oversight of what's going on. And of course, all of it takes place within the framework of the normal checks and balances on fundamental rights, etc., because the whole aim of the proposal is about preserving fundamental rights, not limiting them. So that's where we really came from on that. We have a sort of spectrum of things. We brought forward a legally binding proposal, a directly applicable regulation on online terrorist content. It's making good progress in discussion amongst member states. I hope they will conclude that in December. We'll then be looking really to the European Parliament to get this through before the European Parliament elections next year. Why? Why did we do this? Well, because in every one of the terrorist attacks in the last 2 years or so across the EU, there is an online element, whether through incitement, through instruction, or through glorification. And the problem of online content, online radicalizing content, is a real and serious societal danger. So we acted quite quickly after a long period of sort of, trying voluntary approach, etc., to bring forward what we think is a very good legislative proposal. The member states are acting quickly to reach a common approach on that, and we now look to the Parliament to do that, because if we miss that deadline, realistically we're going to lose a year, and that's an awful lot of time in dealing with the issues we're dealing with.
Lucinda, your time on the stage.
Thank you. And firstly, thank you, Bill and Olivia, for conducting, I think, a really important study and review of the legislation and its application in Germany so far. I suppose I'll just give a little, maybe kind of overview of where the counter-extremism project is coming from in this. We really felt it was important. There's been a lot of talk, as Bill has said, and speculation about the legislation in Germany. It's been picked up in international media, amongst policy makers across the European Union, and obviously here in Brussels. But there's been very little understanding of how it would work and how it is working. So I know it's early days, but I think this is really valuable. The Counter-Extremism Project has been working across the European Union. We're very active here in Brussels, engaging with the institutions, as James will know, and also with member state governments. And I guess inevitably, particularly those which have been affected by significant terror attacks over the last number of years. And we have, I suppose, increasingly come to the view that there is a really urgent need for coordination, for clarity across the European Union about how to approach this really difficult and tricky issue, and in our opinion, for standardized regulation. And so we really welcome the Commission's initiative on this. I think that it's been interesting to see how the Commission has worked with the tech companies and platforms to try to find solutions. There have been, obviously voluntary initiatives. We're all familiar with the Internet Forum and the different ways in which policymakers have been engaging and liaising with tech companies. But we really strongly feel that the time has come for clarity and for a standardized approach. So the German law, I think, provides an interesting starting point for that. And I think, as we have seen from the presentation from Bill and Olivia, some of the sort of the worst case scenarios and the scare stories have not materialized. So from what we can see, it really has not, and I think most of the tech companies would acknowledge this, it has not led to mass takedowns and any really serious restriction of freedom of expression, and that's very important, obviously, to all of us. But whether it has achieved its objectives in terms of streamlining the approach of tech companies is also questionable. So there's definitely really important lessons to learn, I think, from our EU Brussels-based policymakers as they approach particularly the coming months, and particularly when it gets to the European Parliament. Interestingly, and I'm sure many of you in the room have been following the European Parliament's Terror Committee, which has now agreed its draft report, and it'll go to plenary in Strasbourg in December. And actually, one of the key points is that our legislators are calling for regulatory action at EU level. So I guess the ball, I'm sure James would agree with this, the ball is now in their court very firmly. And I hope that they will look at the study from Germany on NetzDG and see how it's applicable in finalising the regulation. And there are a few points, I think, from our point of view. The German law, its scope is much broader than what's proposed from the European Commission. And we think that a focused and more defined target is wise. That's I guess, not surprising, because we are the Counter-Extremism Project, so we have a very particular focus on particularly on CVE and trying to eliminate and eradicate extremism and violent extremism from internet platforms. I think a couple of things from the German law that are relevant. One is that um, this law has to apply much more broadly, so not just to large tech platforms with a large revenue base, because largely because we're seeing terrorist groups and terrorist cells moving from platform to platform. So they don't just stay with the trusted large tech platforms, obviously, and so it's important that others are caught within the scope of the legislation. At the same time, the challenge is to ensure that it doesn't become anti-competitive, and that it doesn't effectively price other platforms out of the market. So that's a really delicate balancing act, I think, from the Commission's point of view, which I know they are conscious of. So we certainly would feel that there are solutions to that, like, for example, pooling resources, and ensuring that by obliging the larger tech firms, for example, to contribute to creating a common database, for example, that could be used by all platforms, that you would get around a lot of the initial challenging setup and cost obstacles, which I think Change.org in particular identified in our German study. The other thing that we firmly believe has to be included in the legislation is measures around re-uploads. So we don't believe that it's practical or realistic that you can eliminate systemic abuse of platforms unless there is a very clear responsibility on tech companies to prevent re-upload of extremist and terrorist content. And just one small exercise that we engaged in this year was a study which we carried out just focused on YouTube. And this is really to demonstrate how easily this can be done if the companies and indeed our policymakers have the will to do it, the political will to do it. So using a very, very tiny database of just 229 known ISIS terror videos, and using 183 keywords, we spent, our team in New York spent 3 months effectively scraping the internet with technology that we have developed called eGlyph. It's a hashing technology. I can talk about it a bit more later. And by deploying that technology with just these 229 terror videos, we found 1,348 ISIS videos have been uploaded, just using that narrow database of videos. And some really interesting and I think relevant and important findings as we went through that study. These videos earned in that time 163,000 views of terror content. 60% of the accounts remained live after the videos were uploaded, after the videos were removed. So the accounts that were posting them were not removed. 278 accounts in total uploaded the 1,348 videos. 24% of the videos remained online for more than 2 hours. So you could say, well, 24% isn't a particularly large percentage, but when it leads to 163,000 views, it's pretty significant. 76% of the videos remained on YouTube for less than 2 hours, but they still received a total of 14,801 views. So even in that short period of time, they were shared and disseminated and viewed repeatedly and prolifically. Another stat that I think is interesting from that is that 91% of the videos were uploaded more than once. So it's not that new content is constantly being generated, but rather the same content is being taken off one platform and re-uploaded on another, or taken off the same platform and uploaded on that same platform again, often within a couple of hours. So there is a huge problem, and we have the technology to ensure the prevention of re-uploading the same terror content, but it is not being deployed, and that is something that we feel has to be a part of any new legislation at EU level. So it's a really important one for us. I mentioned that the technology that we used has been developed by us. It was in fact developed initially to target, I'm talking more than 15 years ago, to target child pornography. And it is the technology, it was developed by Professor Hani Farid, who's an advisor to the Counter-Extremism Project and a professor at Berkeley University. It was developed by him in conjunction with Microsoft at the time. And it forms the basis for the hashing technology, which prevents the re-uploading of child pornography around the world. There is a database maintained independently, which basically flagged content is maintained on, and it prevents, to a large extent, the re-upload of the same content. We advocate that the same approach be taken. Obviously, this technology has become more sophisticated. It has been developed over the last number of years. Originally, it was called PhotoDNA. It was simply based on photographic images. Now it's much more dynamic, and it can target and deal with videos, with sound recognition, and all sorts of other features. So we have over the last number of years found, as we've been advocating for the deployment of this technology, that the tech companies have resisted and said that really the technology doesn't exist. Clearly, we would dispute that and say the technology does exist. It needs to be maintained independently, and it needs to be available to all tech platforms. So, there are certainly challenges logistically around how that would be maintained and verified and so on. But we really do believe that if the will is there, it can be done. And the obvious vehicle for that is this legislation, which is currently under discussion in the council. So that's just perhaps to set the scene a little bit in terms of where we're coming from, and some of the I think maybe shortcomings in the NetzDG law, which we would like to see addressed in this forthcoming regulation.
Thank you. Jens, your time, and then we will have time for questions at the end. Yeah.
Thank you, Bill, for the invitation to talk here today, and thank you for the report. So CDT looks after the internet as an open space for free expression, access to information, education, and public debate. So that is the mission and the sort of the angle that we're coming at these problems from. So we certainly had grave concerns about the NetzDG when it was debated, when it was adopted, and we feared that it would have a disproportionate and harmful impact on public debate and free expression in Germany. Now, looking at at the report, I think it's a very sober and honest assessment of the law and its impact, in as far as we can determine its impact. But I agree that we don't see evidence of a sort of a floodgate of unwarranted requests for takedowns. We don't see at least from the outside, a serious impact on political debate, on free expression in Germany. We also, as you said, don't know whether it has had any material impact on the problem that people wanted to solve. But I think the most important conclusion that I take from the report is the importance of judges and courts in establishing, in determining what is the boundary of the law when it comes to free expression and debate. Of the removal requests made under the law, only about 10 to 27% were accommodated. So that means that between 90 and 73% of the reports of the complaints were made about content that apparently was not illegal, at least until some court says that it was illegal. So there appears to be great confusion about what constitutes illegal hate speech in Germany. Um, I think that confusion is broad, is everywhere. This is a very difficult concept to clearly define and delineate. And so we see this also in the hate speech code of conduct and the way that that has operated. So what we see there is that removal rates following reports made under the code, they went up during the exercise from 28 to 70%. And so these flaggings were made by NGOs with specialist knowledge in the law, and they were made only with reference to the law, not terms of service. But companies could, of course, take down based on terms of service. But so it just shows the complexity and the difficulty, even for knowledgeable people, to understand what exactly is and what is not legal. And so that just goes to show this is not this function of determining the legality of speech cannot be left to company reviewers, automated tools, and trusted flaggers. So that's where I would leave it with NetzDG. About the terrorist content regulation. So first of all, it's of course a serious issue and a very important problem for the EU and its member states to deal with, and of course the EU and its member states have taken a large number of initiatives in this space, and many of them focused on internet content. And the Internet Forum has been in operation for the past 3 years or so. Now, this new regulation it's stated justification to combat terrorist content online is based on the assumption that terrorist content inevitably leads people to carry out terrorist acts, and so that if we could sanitize and scrub the internet of this kind of material, we would also remove the threat of terrorist violence, and then that would indeed be a very strong case for very strong regulation. But it is much more complex than that, according to the experts. I quote the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion of and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. She commented on a draft UK bill in this area, and she notes the danger of employing simplistic conveyor belt theories of radicalization to violence, including terrorism. And she cautions against this idea of a conveyor belt theory of turning radicalization into violent extremism. The Rand Corporation had a report that came out with similar conclusions. I guess you have heard you know about this research, and they note that the evidence does not necessarily support the suggestion that the internet accelerates radicalization or replaces the need for individuals to meet in person during the radicalization process, etc., etc. And we have similar views from the UK Reviewer of Terrorism Legislation, from researchers at King's College London. So that doesn't mean that you should do nothing about these problems, obviously. Nobody is advocating that. But you should make sure that your responses are proportionate and measured and focus on the problem at hand. So in July 2017, the Commission set up its high-level Commission expert group on radicalization, and its mandate was to assess all of the EU's radicalization, extremism, counterterrorism efforts, and provide guidance and recommendations for further work. And what they said about online content was that we recommend for the Commission member states to continue their efforts within the Internet Forum to reduce terrorist and extremist content online and to support the development of alternative and counter narratives et cetera, et cetera. So the high-level group did not use this opportunity to request additional regulation at this point. We made a similar recommendation when we responded to the Commission's consultation that finished in June. That was the precursor to the regulation. We said that without compelling evidence to the contrary, we did not think that there was a need for further legislative initiatives at this time. But obviously the Commission saw things differently. Now, in a nutshell, we certainly want to be constructive in our input and in our review of the regulation, and we will absolutely work with member states and with Parliament to provide, I think, some limitations, some safeguards, some clarifications that might be helpful in the process. And I think we will be looking for clarifications in terms of definitions. They are very broad in the regulation. The definitions in the Terrorism Directive from 2017 are very broad, and it is on that basis, given those broad definitions, we have to be extremely careful about what kinds of proactive measures, what kinds of duties of care we impose on such a broad range of hosts, from the global social media networks down to individual blog posts with comment sections and so on. I think the idea that, for example, imposing one or another filtering technology and expect that will be able to capture and assess whether a piece of content is journalism, whether it's debate, whether it's discussion, etc. I think that is probably an unrealistic expectation, and so we need some clarifications there. Finally, on the authorities, we certainly want to make sure that authorities that are appointed pay due regard to freedom of expression and public debate. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, we've heard, sorry, we still have about 20 minutes left for questions. Lauren back there will hand you the mic, because any hands? One right here. And please identify afterwards. Please identify yourself too.
Hi, I'm Torben David with Bitkom, the German Digital Association. I have a question for technically all the board, I guess. Something that we haven't really touched upon is SMEs and startups and how they would comply with this law. We have a lot of startup and SME members who we know would struggle a lot when there's 3 to 4 employees to comply with a removal order within 1 hour at any given point of the day, or to even appoint a single point of contact. So I would just like to know what your thoughts are on SMEs and their inclusion in this proposal, and how maybe the burden could be lessened for SMEs. Thank you.
Okay. Ahead, but we'll get the answer. We found, in Germany, they had the 2 million user cutoff, so you had to be fairly big to fall under this. Only 4 companies did, and they didn't include other messaging services or other types of platforms. But with your proposal, James, how do you see this working for small companies, or not working?
I think the beauty of a removal order based on a clear legal definition, I look at Jens on that, which is something that the council is further working on at the moment, is that it's just something that you comply with. Even for the smallest SME, this is not a problem. My hesitation with exempting smaller platforms from this is because, as Lucinda has said, as bigger platforms clamp down on this thing, the people who post this stuff, they vote with their feet and they move elsewhere. It does say, in terms of the the draft regulation, in terms of the automatic measures, it does have some recognition of the size of the platform and some stuff in there. But in terms of a removal order, if you're in the market of being a hosting service provider, then keep the phone by your bed, or have a system that you can do this. Because I think Europol found there were at least 200 platforms that were being used for hosting terrorist content. The member state I know the best, they found 400 in the case of Daesh, ISIS. So the problem is, in putting forward a piece of legislation, you don't want to instantly create a loophole which will just displace terrorist content somewhere else. So whilst the Commission is there to support and help smaller platforms in this, and member states I'm sure are, I think if you from the outset make an exemption, then you just put the focus for the people who want to post this stuff in the direction of the smaller platforms, which is not in anybody's interest, I think.
Lucinda, I saw you. Is there a way to make this technology, make it affordable for even startups?
Well, the first thing I would say is that all companies, have a civic, a social, and a moral responsibility here. And just by dint of your size, you can't sort of absolve yourself from that responsibility. So I think that has to be reflected in the proposed legislation, and it also, as James has said, risks creating a loophole which will be exploited very, very quickly by very, very clever organizations if smaller platforms are exempted. I do think there are things that can be done. One of the things that we have suggested is the creation of a fund which would help to train and prepare and prep smaller firms to comply. And the other very simple and obvious solution is to deploy technology. I understand and fully appreciate the concern that Jens has expressed around, filtering technology, being potentially abused or potentially not being capable of discerning certain content from other content. But that's not actually what we're proposing. By proposing a hashing technology, you are actually using content which has already been verified by humans to be extremist content. So, whether it's law enforcement agencies or trusted flaggers, it is content that has been determined to be illegal. We're talking about, beheading videos or bomb-making videos, stuff that is not, in any way questionable. It is absolutely clear. Again, by creating an independent data bank of those images and videos through this hashing technology and making it available to smaller platforms free of charge, then there's really no excuse. So there has to be a will to comply, obviously. But I mean, we have offered eGlyph the technology for free to all of the platforms, large and small. It has already been developed, and so there's no charge or cost involved. So there are very simple and straightforward ways to address what are legitimate concerns, and I absolutely acknowledge that.
Jens, do you have a note, or we can go on to the next question? Okay. Yes.
I wanted to ask you. Robert Soltic, European Commission, DG.com. I wanted to ask you what from this German law we can learn for the actions on disinformation as orchestrated attacks on EU policies, member states, by foreign or internal actors. Is there anything in Germany NetzDG that can be useful for the Commission action plan, which will be adopted early December?
Before you answer, I guess it was James and the panelists, I would say we really didn't study that. We didn't get into the specific types of content. There was a little bit of a, but it was still general provisions, and correct me if I'm wrong. And there are some cases that you can look at from Twitter, which posts its data on this Lumen database, but it wasn't really, we didn't look at the impact of fake news or Russian-inspired stuff that was going to hit. And it's becoming more and more of a concern, I know, before the European elections. So, sorry, Olivia?
Yeah, I just wanted to stress it's not a very strong dimension within the law. I mean, this is one of the criticisms actually of that the Green Party had, for example, that there needs to be more of a focus on misinformation, fake news, use of social bots, things like that. And while it is illegal to spread propaganda from organizations that are unconstitutional, that's one of the criminal offenses included, it doesn't address fake news at large, I think, which is what you're referring to.
James, I think you had something to say on, no?
Okay, thank you. Good question. Of course, we're thinking a lot about fake news and misinformation, which is in the same category really as terrorist content insofar as a cyber-enabled threat. But I think when we're looking in terms of that, we're looking less at the content, which is less easy to spot and define, and more at the sort of channels and the delivery mechanism with it. I mean, there's a part of that piece which is about rebuttal and counter-narratives, which is sort of dealing with the symptoms of it. But there's a big part of the piece about the channels through which it's transmitted. And when we brought forward proposals in April on this, we asked the platforms to do various things. And they have come up with, in late October, a code of practice on that. And I think we'll be looking actually, which is all wonderful, but I'm looking for things which are measurable and are going to happen in the short term, particularly with the perspective of the European elections coming up. So you could do a lot of things, and the things are around greater transparency and traceability and accountability, and particularly about provenance, I think. Because, for example, most people don't realize, I think, that their news feed is individually tailored. It's based on a sort of algorithm on what they've looked at before and things that they've liked and people that they are friends with online. It would be good if people knew that they are actually being shown content which sort of builds on itself, the sort of filter bubble effect. It would be good to identify content which is coming from bots, because there's an awful lot of that. And if you look at misinformation campaigns, they are used to just bombard people and to game the algorithms in that sort of way, because they become the most sort of popular trending things. Fake accounts. We've seen some stuff already through the code of practice from the platforms saying that they've blocked the creation of fake accounts or they've stopped new fake accounts. What about the millions of fake accounts that already exist? And there are millions of them by the platform's own admission. And also then the provenance of the news content. Anything that's political content, I think, should clearly be labeled as such, and you should have the right to know where it came from and who paid for it. But what about the other content that sort of comes in your news feed? It would be good if you could know what the provenance of that was. So, for instance, I'd feel more confident about it if I knew it came from a source that I could identify in some way, than if it came from a source that I might not trust as much. So I think, as I say, there's a lot of work going on at the moment because there was a mandate from the European Council to come up with an action plan on this. But in terms of fake news, the recipe is slightly different. It's a lot more about channels and sort of response and resilience than it is about content itself.
I'll just add one small point, and that is, parallels with NetSDG and the problems there is definition, right? That it's very important to be extremely precise about what you mean when you say false. I think false news is the more adopted term now. so that you do not capture biased reporting, very partisan content, etc. That is not what you should be trying to focus on. That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Henk?
Henk Mannekens, BT. On this topic, I just wanted to know whether there is some more details available on the kind of platforms that you normally find this kind of terrorist content. So you mentioned 250 platforms in the reports of Europol. Member states mentioned 400. I'm asking because in general the Commission proposal was based on the ID, or it is in the proposal itself that is mainly targeting large audiences. Whereas in the scope, of course, you have a very wide scope, and they're also including, like, for example, cloud services, which can be very difficult to understand what actually is meant. Does it mean cloud services used by consumers, whether it's business, whether it's encrypted services? So there is a whole, so in a way, the balance about the potential application to all these different smaller technologies versus also the stringency of some measures. Removal orders are okay, you just have to obey the removal order, but if you have to obey within 1 hour and you have to do that 24 hours by 7 days, I can imagine that for some companies this may be difficult.
James, I think it's for you.
Thanks. What I'd say about the 24/7 stuff is terrorism never sleeps, so you want to counter it, and I think that's quite important. Yeah, I mean the scope of the regulation was deliberately defined as hosting service providers, which is a little broader than platforms, simply because if you're going to do a piece of legislation, you want it to have some future validity, and the pace of change in these things is quite fast, so you don't want to be legislating for today and tomorrow's and yesterday's problem and avoiding future. You do see trends that some stuff is, for instance, in Google Docs or whatever, is shared in that way, and that's not the classic sort of platform that you would think of if you were thinking of social media. Again, the Commission proposes this stuff. This is all a very live discussion amongst the member states at the moment, but I think it is a discussion which hopefully will come to an end sometime in the next few weeks, this side of the Christmas break.
Okay, 2 more questions. I think that's about what we have time for. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Mohamed Rajai Barakat. I work for some Arabophone TVs, BBC, France 24, about European affairs. I would like to ask you, because Mr. Morrison spoke about classification, and you spoke also about videos who can be forbidden. Do you have a parameters when we can consider this video as dangerous and it contains some hateful speeches, or and don't you think that using technology for this is very dangerous for our liberty? Because well, it's based on, I think, some keywords, and if you use these keywords, you are classified as a visitor of some webs. If a student is going to make a study about political Islam, maybe he put Islam, and maybe is going to be conducted through a website which is not, he didn't want to do that. Don't you think that it's dangerous for our liberty and our freedom of speech? Thank you very much.
Yes, yeah, for you too.
Sorry, guys.
But Lucinda, you might want to jump in on that.
I mean, we're very conscious in bringing forward these proposals, not inadvertently to do the work of the people that we're trying to stop abusing the internet for them, if you see what I mean. So as I said before, this is very much not about censorship, and academic study and that sort of thing is fine and is not covered by the scope of this. And that's why the definition is about terrorist organizations and content that sort of glorifies their action or emanates from them. So, I mean, I think it's pretty clear what the target audience is. It's also why the whole thing is based on fundamental rights, and it has a carefully set out approach, which basically means that you disable the content, but you have to store it. So, and that there is an appeal procedure. Now, how much, Daesh, for instance, would be using an appeal procedure is different. But it does mean that, if there is a legitimate reason or if it's wrong, the content is there, it could be re-uploaded. So it's a matter of time. Now, personally, I think that's a price worth paying if it's about stopping the spread of this stuff. Because I'm sorry, I disagree with Jens. I think this stuff is particularly pernicious. It does target people in ways that are sort of psychometrically it exploits psychometric vulnerabilities in people, and it taps into things in a way because it streams straight into their bedroom in a way that meeting people doesn't. Now, it may well be that you end up from going from this to meeting people and, etc. But there are recent cases in France where, you have people who have never met with anybody, they've never traveled anywhere, and then they suddenly go off and try and perpetrate an attack. So there is something in that, not just sort of making it up. There is something about this particular channel that is dangerous. So I agree with you. I mean, the objective is to keep the internet open and safe and open for free speech, absolutely. And that's why there are a lot of checks and balances in it. And that's why the definition is tight on it. So I think the issues that you raise, I think, are legitimate concerns. They're things that we thought of in the process when we were drafting this. I'm confident that the way that we have drafted it will avoid those sort of unintended consequences. But at the end of the day, I truly believe that the objective of the thing is both urgent and is very much in society's interest.
I would echo all of what James said. I think just picking up one point that you made, and I think it's important to reiterate, we are not talking about artificial intelligence or technology that would make decisions about content. We are not advocating for that. Some of the tech companies themselves have suggested that this is something that can be done in the future. We believe that it's a long, long way off. We don't believe that the technology is anywhere close to that point. So what we are talking about is deploying technology online and on platforms in order to prevent the upload of content that has already been determined by humans as being illegal content. So just to be very clear about that distinction, and that would in effect have a multiplier effect. So it would speed up the prevention of the upload of known content. At the moment, I mean, it is quite extraordinary, and I think it's important to make this point. I mean, we talk to law enforcement agencies all over Europe who have dozens and dozens of police officers who should be out detecting crime and doing what they do best, but they are sitting in rooms, looking at computers, taking down content that has already been flagged and reporting it to tech companies. It is an outrageous waste of taxpayers' money, human resources, and it's not working. It's literally a drop in the ocean. So what we want to do is be able to multiply the impact of that and actually have police officers doing what they should be doing, which is policing and detecting crime, not sitting staring at the most gruesome videos. And obviously those law enforcement agencies then have to provide all sorts of rehabilitation and psychological services to those police officers who are having to do that. It is an outrageous waste of resources, and it is unnecessary, and that is effectively what we are saying. You will always have to have some human verification, but we can do an awful lot more through technology, but not through artificial intelligence. But rather through the hashing technologies that we're talking about. And so I didn't actually earlier respond to the point that Jens was making about the multiplicity of approaches. And you know, you're absolutely preaching to the converted, I think, when you speak to the Counter-Extremism Project on that. And I don't want to speak for the Commission, but I'm pretty sure, because I know the work that they're doing across a whole range of approaches, you know, whether it's counter-narratives, supporting grassroots initiatives. These are happening at EU level, they are supported by the European institutions, they're happening at national level, at regional level. We need more of it, you know, there is no one simple solution to this. Online radicalization is a reality. It's a major problem. That is what the legislation that has come from the Commission is targeting, and we need to put that in place. But that does not absolve us of our responsibility to do all of the other things that we need to be doing. Absolutely agree with you on that.
We've, do you have a last word, or Jens? Yes.
One thing that, coming back on what James said about it, absolutely, I agree that I'm sure that terrorist groups can and have used these tools very effectively and perniciously to target particular people that were vulnerable, etc. What we need to make sure is that this does not result in too broad a category of content disappearing. For example, I think you should be able to find online Dabig, the magazine that ISIS published. I don't know if it still does, because it's important documentation, and we need to understand these things. So let's make sure that we understand what the intent is behind a person hosting or writing about or publishing something before we automatically filter away that content. That's it. Thank you.
I see people getting up. We've overrun our time. I guess we could continue, maybe another event later in the year. Thank you all for coming. Wish my American friends good Thanksgiving. And I didn't even get to ask the question about transatlantic relations and that. We'll leave it for next time. Thank you.